evening. Chairman Guofeng of China, the successor to Mao Zedong, arrived in Europe on Monday at the start of a 4-week visit. It's the first time any top Chinese leader has come to Western Europe, and he'll be here in Britain for a week at the end of this month. Tonight, in place of our usual style of program, we're going to show the first ever public interview with Chairman Hua. The Chinese government itself chose Felix Greene as the interviewer. It is the only interview to which they have ever agreed. Felix Greene has been a frequent visitor to China since the mid-50s and is regarded by the Chinese authorities as a sympathetic friend. The interview is also unusual for us in that all the questions were discussed in advance, and all the film included comes from official Chinese sources. We thought, however, that the unique nature of the interview and the chance to discover a little more about the man who leads a quarter of mankind justifies this departure from our normal style. From Peking, then, Felix Greene reports.
In 1976, Mao Zedong died. The whole of China was in mourning. It was 30 years ago this year, after years of revolutionary struggle, a war against the Japanese and a bitter civil war, that Mao Zedong entered Peking victoriously, riding in a captured American jeep past captured American guns. On October the 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong announced the establishment of the People's Republic of China. Now, and for the past 3 years, China's had a new leader, Chairman Guofeng. At 59, he is not only chairman of the Communist Party, premier of the State Council, but also chairman of the Military Commission. Even Mao Zedong never held these 3 key positions simultaneously. A few weeks ago, at his residence on the outskirts of Peking, Guofeng granted me his first personal interview.
Welcome. How are you?
Very well.
Thank you.
I like your place here very much.
我很喜欢你这个地方。你是不是在这儿有的时候划船？
Although he is the leader of nearly 1,000 million people, he is probably the least well-known of any world leader. I knew from past experience that Chinese leaders are reluctant to talk about themselves. But nevertheless, I tried. I know that you do not like to talk about yourself, but I would like to ask 1 or 2 personal questions, if I may. What were the conditions of your family when you were young?
我的家老家是在山西。
I was born in Jiaoshan County, Shanxi Province. My father died when I was 6 years old, and I lived with my mother and elder brother. We were rather poor. After graduating from primary school when I was 13, I stayed home for a year because I couldn't afford to attend middle school. When I was 14, I enrolled in a newly opened vocational school in Jiaoshan County and stayed there until July the 7th, 1937, when the Japanese started their war against China.
How old were you when you joined the revolutionary movement and when you took part against the war against the Japanese? Could you tell us something about that?
我是17岁
I joined the revolution in 1938 when I was 17 years old, and joined the Chinese Communist Party in the same year. The Kuomintang armies retreated before the oncoming Japanese aggressors, while the communist-led 8th Route Army made their way behind enemy lines to carry on guerrilla warfare and establish bases of resistance. The mountainous area of my county was a guerrilla base of resistance surrounded by enemy strongholds. There was bitter fighting, with the Japanese launching mopping-up operations several times a year, during which they practiced a burn-all, kill-all, and loot-all policy. Relying on the people, we persevered in the struggle until final victory. I worked for a long time in my own county, serving as chairman of the Anti-Japanese League, chairman of the Armed Forces Committee of the county, party committee, and party secretary of the county. I was active in the front lines of battle against the Japanese, both on the plains and in the hills.
As an exception to his general rule, Chairman Hua arranged to have photographs taken which have never before been made public, even in China. This is the tiny two-roomed cottage where he was born. And here is the young Hua at the age of 14. His family was too poor to think of being photographed, but this picture is part of a class photograph taken when he entered the vocational school. At the age of 21, he was already in the uniform of a guerrilla fighter. After 1949, Hua went to Hunan province in central China, Mao's home province.
我不是战后去的湖南，我是
When I went to Hunan province, the War of Liberation wasn't yet over. I went south with the PLA in the spring of 1949. We arrived in Hunan in July, and the provincial capital, Changsha, was liberated peacefully in August. I worked in Hunan for 23 years.
During those years, Hua was married. His wife is virtually unknown in China, and this photograph was taken especially for this program. While he was in Hunan, Hua gained a reputation for administrative skills and was put in charge of the planning and construction of the massive Shaoshan irrigation and canal project. He moved rapidly up the political ladder. In 1969, he was elected to the Central Committee of the Communist Party and then first secretary of the Hunan Communist Party.
也就经过4个月的时间吧，
We organized 100,000 people to work on the irrigation project and completed its main channel and north channel in 10 months. The project was inaugurated on June the 1st, 1966. It has worked well in the last dozen years. Besides its main function of irrigating more than 60,000 hectares of land, the project can also generate some electricity, help to block floodwaters, serve inland navigation, and breed fish.
I'd like to ask you, when did you first meet Chairman Mao Zedong?
毛主席在过去经常到各省区。
Chairman Mao used to travel the country on inspection tours and would come often to Hunan province. So I could often meet him and report to him on my work. As I recall, I met him for the first time in the early 50s.
1971, I think, you were called to Peking. Was this in connection with the Lin Piao affair and his attempted overthrow of Mao Zedong?
我是1972年，71年的2月调到北京来工作的。
I was transferred to work in the State Council in February 1971 and put in charge of agriculture, finance, and commercial affairs. Soon after my arrival, Premier Zhou Enlai sent me on an investigation tour of provinces in South China so I could become familiar with conditions in the country as a whole. So my transfer had nothing to do with Lin Biao and his attempted overthrow of Chairman Mao. Shall we move indoors to continue our conversation?
After Hua's arrival in Peking in 1971, Mao appointed him to a number of important posts. The management of the agricultural program, for example. In 1973, he was elected to the 22-member Politburo, and 17 months later he became Minister of Public Security. Zhou Enlai had died in January 1976. As Mao Zedong himself declined in health, and especially during his last illness, Mao relied increasingly on the younger man. You became Premier and first Vice Chairman in April of 1976. Who elected you to these positions? And how did it feel to be taking on these enormous responsibilities?
Following the death of Comrade Zhou Enlai in 1976, Comrade Mao Zedong took some extraordinary measures. He first nominated me as acting Premier of the State Council and appointed me to preside over the routine business of the party's Central Committee, a nomination which was approved by the Political Bureau of the Central Committee. Later, in April of the same year, he nominated me for the post of first Vice Chairman of the Central Committee and Premier of the State Council. These were for me extremely heavy responsibilities, especially at that particular juncture. I felt I was not up to the job politically or ideologically, so I asked Comrade to reconsider his recommendation. But he stuck to his decision, and it was passed by the Political Bureau. This decision of his was a heavy blow to the Gang of Four, who were conspiring to usurp party and state leadership.
In July 1976, the industrial city of Tangshan was devastated by an earthquake. It was an appalling disaster. 700,000 people, it is estimated, lost their lives. The relief organization was a massive one. Within hours, convoys of troops, doctors, nurses and food were on their way to the stricken area. Hua himself headed the operation and went to supervise it. The way in which it was handled added to his reputation for administrative ability. Two months later, Mao Zedong was dead. A million and more attended the memorial service in Tiananmen Square, the Square of Heavenly Peace, and the service was relayed to all parts of China.
同志们、朋友们，今天首都大政军机关、国人兵以及各界群众的代表，在天安门广场举行隆重的追悼大会，同全国高级人民一道。
Though he was technically junior to others in the higher ranks of the leadership, the only oration at this great ceremony was given by Guofeng. This was another indication that he was likely to be Mao's successor. The deaths of Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai both occurred in 1976. Was this a very critical time for China?
1976年是我们中国不平凡的一年。
1976 was for us in China an extraordinary year, a year of severe trials. Comrade Mao Zedong and comrades Zhou Enlai and Chu Da all died in that year. They led the Chinese people for more than 50 years, and it was under their leadership that the Chinese people, after arduous struggles, founded the People's Republic of China and stood up in the world. So their passing away plunged our party and people into deep sorrow. The Gang of Four, taking advantage of this extraordinary moment, accelerated their counter-revolutionary activities to usurp supreme power both in the party and the government. It was a critical moment, and the life or death of our party and state were at stake. What did the future hold for China? Would China adhere to the revolutionary cause pioneered by comrades Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, and other veteran revolutionaries? Or would the Gang of Four succeed in usurping leadership and enforcing a fascist dictatorship? The fate of the Chinese people was hanging in the balance. The Chinese people felt great anxiety, and our friends abroad worried for us too.
Six months after the funeral service for Mao, Tiananmen Square was the scene of another mass gathering. But the mood this time was very different. For this one was to celebrate Mao's appointment as chairman and the arrest of the Gang of Four, who had been maneuvering for overall power even before Mao's death. It was 6 months, I think, after you became premier that the Gang of Four were arrested. Was this a difficult decision to take?
Of course, it wasn't an easy decision to take. They were all members of the political bureau. One was a vice chairman of the party central committee. One was Comrade Mao Zedong's widow. They'd been engaged in conspiratorial activities for many years. These were all factors that had to be taken into account. But the late Comrade Mao Zedong himself had, in meetings of the political bureau, exposed and criticized their factionalist activities and their wild ambitions, and said that the problem which they posed had to be resolved. They were, in fact, quite isolated within the political bureau and in the party as a whole. Moreover, they'd lost all popular support among the masses. In 1976, when Chairman Mao was critically ill, and following his death, the gang stepped up their activities and were about to unleash their scheme to usurp supreme power in the party and government. Meanwhile, because of their incitement and sabotage, railway traffic virtually ground to a halt, many factories were shut down, and the economy as a whole tottered on the brink of disaster. So a decision had to be made without delay. On October the 6th, 1976, we in the party centre took the decisive action which successfully smashed the Gang of Four.
How widespread was the support of the Gang of Four at this time? Was there any danger of an actual civil war?
Well, we thought at first that perhaps there would be some trouble in Shanghai, where they had been building up their influence for more than a decade. But there was no major, medium, or even minor disturbances whatsoever. Before we announced the news, many people had already heard about it through the grapevine. And there was circulated the saying at the time that 4 pests had been got rid of in a sanitation campaign. When word spread to the cadres and masses in Shanghai, they broke out in celebration of this victory. More than 6 million people spontaneously went onto the streets to parade in support. The problem was resolved without our having to fire a single shot or shedding 1 drop of blood. The whole country was calm. I think this answers your question about how widespread was the support of the gang at that time.
Many people are asking, what is happening to the Gang of Four? Can you tell us something about that?
I can assure you that they are alive, but of course they're in confinement. Like everyone else, they eat and they sleep. We won't mistreat them in the way that they tortured countless cadres. They will have to account fully for their towering crimes against the Chinese people.
Does this mean there might be a trial of the four?
Yes, they will be dealt with in accordance with legal procedures.
Many people in the West think that Chairman Mao's ideas are being discarded. What would you say about this?
西方确实有些人是说我们是偏激毛。
Some people in the West say that we are discarding many of Chairman Mao's ideas, and I know that some even say we're engaged in de-Maoification. This is not at all the case. Even a cursory review of how things stand in China will show exactly the opposite. Lin Biao and the Gang of Four willfully distorted and tampered with Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought. They alleged that Chairman Mao had developed Marxism, Leninism to the highest peak, and that one sentence of his had the strength of 10,000 sentences. They claimed that there was a bourgeois class within the Communist Party, that veteran cadres were bourgeois revolutionaries and had or would inevitably become capitalist roaders. We launched a nationwide campaign to criticize and repudiate these utterly idealistic fallacies of theirs, and called on the people to learn and master Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought in a comprehensive and faithful way. We did this to clarify the issues, and thus defend and develop this system of thought. Our current national discussion on the question of the criterion of truth is exactly what Comrade Mao Zedong advocated all along, namely, to proceed in all cases from reality, to seek truth from facts, and to integrate theory with practice. These are all basic tenets of our ideology. This discussion has helped to reapply the principles long advocated by Comrade Mao Zedong. His great and meritorious service to the Chinese people is immortal, for all our victories were scored under the guidance of his thought, which integrated the basic principles of Marxism, Leninism with the concrete practices of the Chinese Revolution. But for his thought, there would have been no new China.
As Chairman and Premier of the State Council, Hua presided over this year's National People's Congress in Peking. His message to the Congress was that the economic and social damage of the past years, under the influence of Lin Biao and the Gang of Four, must be repaired, and that China must modernize with all speed. It is a message that he and other Chinese leaders had already taken to industrial workers around the country, stressing the importance of modernizing their own factories wherever possible, or with techniques taken from more advanced countries and applied to Chinese conditions. With China's immense rural population, priority was given to agriculture and light industry over heavy industry. But these visits by Guofeng had another purpose, to get himself more widely known personally to the far-flung and multinational Chinese peasantry. For though he was holding posts of such importance, Hua was still relatively an unknown figure outside of Hunan province. He had already traveled to some of the most remote parts of the country, including Tibet, mixing with the peasants, attending traditional sports, such as here in Xinjiang in the West, reassuring the many national minority peoples that their problems also are not being forgotten. Talk of catching up with advanced countries by the end of the century must seem at these distant areas, but many other developing countries have failed to include their rural population in the drive to modernize. Can China preserve equality and unity while encouraging intellectual and technical excellence, which are in such short supply. As you have said, China is now undergoing a vast attempt to, what I call, catch up with the West, with its modernization program. Many are wondering why China is attempting to do so much so quickly. Why the speed?
从根本上来讲，
The fundamental aim of building socialism is to liberate the productive forces, develop the national economy at high speed, substantially increase the material wealth of society, meet the material and cultural needs of the people to a great extent. China's economy was quite backward in the first place. 10 very precious years were lost owing to sabotage by Lin Biao and a gang of 4. By making great efforts in the last 2 years, we've managed to rehabilitate and even develop somewhat our national economy. But our economy is still far from meeting the needs of our national development and the demand for constantly improving the living standards of our people. Thus, we have to undertake economic development at maximum speed so as to make up for the time lost through their sabotage. Moreover, we believe that a backward country is open to attack. A strong China serves the interest of maintaining peace and stability in the world. We must speed up our modernization program and turn China into a powerful socialist country. When we were drawing up the plan for developing the national economy last year, we decided on measures that were a bit too fast and too daring. We discovered the problem in time. We've decided to devote 3 years, starting from this year, to readjusting, restructuring, consolidating and improving the national economy.
Don't you think that modernization might lead to a kind of westernization of China with all the problems involved? For example, machines replace workers. So won't this only increase your problem of unemployment?
I think you may have noticed that China's modernization program rests on 2 premises. The first is to achieve modernization on the foundation of our socialist system. The second is that it must be carried out in the light of conditions in China and done in a Chinese way. Socialism and modernization are closely linked and not at all contradictory. There are no grounds whatever for thinking that it will inevitably lead to westernization or bring us back to capitalism. Our accepting foreign investments and increasing economic and cultural exchanges with other countries may, of course, be accompanied by the spread of some Western influences. This is something to watch out for. We believe that our people can tell the good from the bad and will resist and overcome bad influences. Unemployment is, of course, an important problem. To carry out the modernization program in our own Chinese way proceeds from the reality that China has a large population. We will build modern, large-scale enterprises, but we will also build small and medium-sized enterprises. Handicraft production will long coexist with automation and mechanization. China is still quite backward economically, and there's a need to start new undertakings in almost every field. There are almost unlimited possibilities in store. Lately, to broaden employment opportunities, we've begun to develop urban handicrafts, retail shops and service industries. In this way, we will gradually find jobs for people waiting for employment. Unemployment was caused by the slow growth of our economic and other undertakings in the last decade or so. China is a socialist country. It's entirely possible for her to solve the unemployment problem.
The question of Hong Kong is of the greatest interest not only to the people of Hong Kong, but of the British people too. What part do you think Hong Kong can play in China's modernization program?
I think Hong Kong can do a lot, because it has a number of favorable conditions. There have traditionally been very close ties between Hong Kong and the mainland. Our compatriots in Hong Kong love the motherland and are keenly interested in its progress. Hong Kong is a major free port in Asia that has developed its own industries and technology in recent years. Currently, China has good relations with the United Kingdom and the authorities in Hong Kong. I think that with mutual efforts, there are great potentialities for developing economic cooperation between Hong Kong and the mainland. This will be to our mutual benefit.
On international affairs, the power relationships of the world are changing very rapidly, especially, of course, the growing military power of the Soviet Union. What is China's response to this? And how do you think the Western countries should respond?
Everyone can see that the world today is more turbulent and more tense. World peace and stability is threatened primarily by the intensified rivalry between the two superpowers for world hegemony, and social imperialism has shown a greater tendency to take risks. This characteristic can be observed everywhere in Europe, in the Middle East, in Africa, in the Red Sea and Gulf area, in South Asia, and in Indochina. If this is not combated, if its expansionist and aggressive activities are not checked, the factors making for war will increase, and the danger to world peace and security will grow. Europe is the focus of this rivalry. Yet the balance of military strength is obviously against Western Europe. We've always supported the Western European countries in their efforts for unity and strength. We think a strong and united Europe is important for the cause of deterring hegemonism and for world peace. It's imperative to oppose hegemonism if world peace is to be maintained. There's a close and inseparable relationship between the two. Firmly following Comrade Mao Zedong's theory of the three worlds, we will strengthen our unity with the other third world countries, unite with all forces in the world that can be united with, to oppose hegemonism, and so delay the outbreak of a world war and preserve world peace. There are two things that we in China will always stick to. One is that we ourselves will never seek hegemony. The other is that we will resolutely oppose it. This will remain our position even after our country is modernized. We need an international environment of prolonged peace in which to work for modernization. We shall, as always, strive to develop friendly relations with all countries on the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, and to actively develop trade, economic cooperation, and scientific, technological, and cultural exchanges with other countries on the basis of equality and mutual benefit. Let me take this opportunity to extend my friendly greetings to the peoples of Europe and other countries of the world.
That was Felix Greene's interview with Chairman Hua of China, filmed in Peking before he left for his current European tour, which will bring him to London in 10 days' time. Newsweek will be back next Thursday when David Jessel will be looking at the Conservative government's expected moves to tighten the rules on immigration. Now, good night.